guess let's go over jumping through all these genres. Going from creative nonfiction to fiction. When do you choose when to move which one?
Yeah, I mean, I in some ways I really admire and am jealous of people who have like one creative project that they then kind of they one universe that they can create and do all their stories within that universe. Someone like Liz with Workable Oath, or where everything kind of filters through this one world. You can build this brand and move forward with it. I am way too scattered to do that. So like sometimes I want to do memoir pieces. Sometimes I want to do biographical pieces. Sometimes ridiculous campy, super trendy stuff. Sometimes edit something. So I'm kind of all over the place. Which strength and weakness, I suppose. I tend to lose kind of fan bases every time I move to another project. So like people are interested in my true travel tales, something that I was doing. Like here's some gay porn with pirates. Right here. So but for whatever reason, like it does also keep me kind of nimble creatively. So like for example, going to the porn comics from the memoir stuff. I've been come out of kind of indie comics and this very kind of restrained storytelling style. Kind of panel to panel transitions were are tend to be very staid and very kind of well composed, but kind of a lot of silent beats and stuff in indie comics. But going to porn comics, you have to be. It's all about the money shot, right? It's all about kind of dramatic and more explicit, and so that really forced me out of my box creatively. So that was a good project. And then kind of coming back into memoir and taking some of those lessons. So I like going back and forth. It just depends on the project I'm doing, how I approach it. So.
Do you think that there's a common theme though? Like whether you're talking about pirates or you're talking about memoir?
I am fascinated with questions of identity. Questions of identity or identity politics are kind of interesting to me, for sure. So that tends to be a theme that comes through. So my true travel tales, I spent a lot of years traveling around with a backpack, basically, and traveling also to the third world or kind of around, cheaply, basically. And I would travel oftentimes with my paper and brushes and ink in my backpack and kind of hole up someplace like in Lao or something for $1 a night at some weird little hotel and kind of draw comics for a week and then move on to the next place and do the same thing. And so a lot of my comics around that time were about identity as an American and as kind of as a first world person traveling in third world countries, which I found really fascinating. Hard to swallow, being gay porn stuff. That I got involved with the gay porn industry. I started acting in adult films and so I was picking up stories about sexuality from other people that I was working with, which I found really fascinating. And so I did these series of kind of true stories in that series of kind of true sex stories by people who write porn stars. So people who have kind of public sex lives that are kind of imagined, kind of performed, right? And what are their private stories? How the relationship between private sexuality and public sexuality. And then, obviously stuff around queer identity, which is what this book is about, all different kinds of queer identities and how they manifest in the world. So I guess questions of identity and how you kind of interact with the world, given your own sense of self. That'd be a continual theme.
You talked about traveling with, let's call it analog drawing equipment. Do you use something like an iPad these days?
I still do everything ink on paper, and then I scan that, and we'll do my color work is all digital. So if I'm doing color, it's all digital, and I'll touch things up digitally as well. But I still kind of old school and doing ink on paper. I still have so much to learn about like the brush and the ink and like pens and stuff like that. I haven't even gotten my head around that, much less moving over to completely digital processes. So I don't know. In the future, it sounds like it would actually be a lot easier to travel with an iPad and a stylus, right? It would probably be even lighter than traveling with all that paper and ink. And the ink would always explode in my backpack, which was papers, and anyway.
What do you think is Glamazonia's
So Glamazonia was kind of it's been an interesting process with her as a character. So there was, I don't know if anyone here remembers Tranny Shack so Tranny Shack was this kind of wonderful underground performance venue at the Stud for many years.
Is that going on?
It still exists.
It still exists, that's right. Just not in this weekly version. Now they just do big events, right? So, and there was this kind of time, in San Francisco, queer underground, and I think this is still true to a certain extent with queer San Francisco culture, where things get pretty kind of mushy and fluid in really delightful ways. So, I use the word tranny in Glamazonia. She is a transgender woman, and not actually a drag queen. But she's coming out of this culture where, the word tranny was, back in the early days of Tranny Shack, it was being used for trans women, trans men, drag queens, folk queens, genderqueer people, kind of anyone who's messing around, fucking around with gender would kind of use that term. So that the politics around that term have changed, I think, now, and transgender people are more, some elements of the transgender community are more reluctant to use that term, and I think it has a very specific political context. So it's a little bit tricky me using that word now, especially as a cisgender person. So, but the character was created as this way to kind of, fuck around both with tropes around superheroes and general pop culture, but also around queer identities. So I have all these different kinds for interacting with queer cultures in different ways. So gay men, lesbians, bisexuality, transgender, men, women, and I just kind of make jokes about everything, just trying to poke fun at every aspect of queer culture as a way to kind of celebrate it, and also to kind of, we all want to take everything a little less seriously, hopefully, as well, and have fun with it. So I'm really proud of that series. I mean, I illustrated about 2/3, 3/4 of the book, and then the rest of it I farmed out to other illustrators, and I got different people from different queer communities and straight as well to illustrate different stories. So it's a whole kind of panoply of queer identity stuff, but it's very different from the rest of my work. It's camp. Camp is a very specific kind of humor, which comes out of queer culture and has a specific kind of relationship to the world.
So I guess this idea of playing with queer identity and how it's shifted over time. Every single time I talk to you, that's one of the things that seems to always impress me. It's not just how much you know about comics and the canon of comics and the history of comics, but you're able to connect it in with the actual what's happening at that time and why it was so significant. So here we have No Straight Lines, which seems to kind of be, in a sense, Glamazonia jumping through 4 decades and kind of putting a little bit of,
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a collection of queer comics, and as such, is both a kind of a window into queer history, a very specific kind of interesting window into queer history, and how the world has shifted from from Stonewall on, basically. Because I started off with the first comics coming out of these kind of gag strips that were first published in the early newspapers and gay magazines like that, coming out of the Stonewall riots, and then through different cultural movements like the underground comics movement in the 70s, and the kind of lesbian and feminist comics that were developing there, and then into the kind of punk zines of the 90s, and now web comics, where there's a lot of trans web comics happening now. So different kind of technological, social, political movement, kind of movements and moments in history then have their kind of correlation in terms of the artistic work, right? So it's both a kind of collection of queer history and also of comics history, I guess, would be. And there's a kind of interesting parallel where kind of, post-Stonewall, if you started in 1969, this kind of arc of, queer rights and kind of queer visibility is happening, bizarrely kind of parallel path to visibility and acceptability of comics as a medium, which is kind of fascinating to me.
we talked about the difference between queer characters coming up in mainstream comics versus queer characters being written by queer artists.
Yeah. In the past, I mean, any if there was a queer character in a comic, it would by default be a queer comic because no one would ever touch that material or those kind of characters in any other kind of comics, right? So the only so if a queer character was necessarily a queer comic, that's shifted now. And now you have a gay Archie character and a lesbian Batwoman, right? So which is great, which is awesome. But I think that there's still a need for queer comics as a kind of queer underground because it's the job of the mainstream to assimilate and kind of normalize these characters. It's not their job to dissect their identities and analyze them and from a kind of internal perspective, right? That's the job of queer cartoons, doing that around their own communities. So there's still a kind of need for both. It's not appropriate for a gay character in Archie would talk about transphobia and internalized racism in the gay community. That's not what Archie's about. Archie's about making normalizing gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people in this kind of fantasy environment and providing role models for children, right? That's what that's about. But it's the job of people like Mary Wings and Robert Kirby and to analyze what being queer means and how it kind of shifts over time and in a more sophisticated way, right?
And those would definitely have to be first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
Because you need that perspective.
You do, and I will say that it doesn't mean that the creators need to be queer. Like the way I define queer comics in No Straight Lines is that they're comics about the queer experience, right? Queer identity and realities. But they don't necessarily need to be made by queer creators. I mean, there's several straight creators represented in No Straight Lines, but they're still writing from a kind of internal perspective or an insider perspective. So, for example, the first queer literary comic is really made by Trina Robbins in 1972 for Women's Comics #1. She creates Sandy Comes Out, which was Sandy Crumb is Robert Crumb's sister, and she moved to San Francisco with her baby. At the time, she had divorced her husband, moved in with Robert Crumb and Kaminsky, and Robert immediately tried to cast her off to his greasy cartoonist buddies. She wasn't happy about that. Trina Robbins comes swooping in and says, "Hey, I need a roommate. Why don't you come stay with me?" So she ends up being roommates, and then comes out as a lesbian and then moves into this gay hippie commune in Haight-Ashbury. Trina Robbins does this 3-page story in Women's Comics #1 about her coming out experience called Sandy Comes Out. And Sandy actually helped her write it a little bit, but it's Trina writing about her queer friend. Trina's a straight woman, right? So in that time of identity politics in the early 70s, the idea that a straight person was writing this kind of definitive piece about coming out was kind of a problem for a lot of people. So Mary Wings and Roberta Gregory wrote their pieces in kind of response to that. But now I think when we look back now, our perspective now, we look back and say everybody gives Trina props for doing this, for being the first one to create a queer character and put it into comics in a sophisticated way. So the world's changed a bit over that stuff.
Not to mention the fact that she actually was using it to put this story out there, just put the story out there. The reaction that it got both from possibly straight and gay community created more of a dialogue.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. It was inspiring enough to people both in the underground comics community and also essentially jump-started a queer comics underground. So, Mary Wings saw that and was like, okay, well, she hasn't dealt with the emotional aspects of coming out. So then Mary Wings created come-out comics in the basement of a radical women's karate cooperative. That's what it does in Oregon, and then and sold this stuff as like $1 on the back of mail order $1, and she was doing that within the lesbian community. So, but Trina jump-started all this stuff, right? And so it was important for me to have that piece in here. And now they're good friends, Trina and Mary and Roberta and stuff like that. But it's funny looking back at identity politics from the 70s were very, very different, I think, from a more kind of inclusionary model that we have now.
So I've asked you this before, but for the sake of the audience, why was this anthology needed
I think right now what's happening is, I mean, the world is changing again, so that a lot of this material never existed in the comics industry, right? It wasn't sold in comic book stores. It wasn't serialized in newspapers. It was sold in gay bookstores, serialized in gay newspapers, or underground queer, zines or whatever. So it really existed in its own kind of, and it was sold in those retail spaces. So it really existed in its own queer media ghetto that was completely separated from the rest of the comics industry. When Alison Bechdel came to Alternative Press Expo the first in 2004, I had her on a queer cartoonist panel, my first one there, and she'd been making comics for almost 25 years. It's inarguably one of the greatest cartoonists on the planet, and she had never been to a comic book convention. That's how isolated the queer comics world was from the rest of the comics industry, and that's changed now. I mean, now you have significant presences at all conventions of queer creators, and now queer creators are being published by all different kinds of publishers, not just queer publishers, and also there's the death of the queer media ghetto, right? So the gay newspapers are unfortunately closing, a lot of the gay bookstores are closing. Alison Bechdel used to be able to support herself on Next Watch Out For, which she ran in the newspapers for 25 years. She can't do that anymore. There aren't enough left, right? But she can create a graphic novel that has queer content, and now that can become Times Best Book of the Year, become an international bestseller, be published by a publisher, and that wouldn't have been possible 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? So the world has changed. And this is really, so for every Alison Bechdel that's going to be in Howard Cruz, that will be able to cross over into this new world of kind of integrated publishing and retail and marketing. There's going to be a lot of people who won't. So Haddad Paisan, Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist, is never crossing over into the mainstream. It's always going to be a queer underground book. And so, but I don't want this stuff to vanish. I mean, the worry is that as the gay publishers and the gay bookstores are closing, that all this incredible material from 4 decades of this work, which is vanished, no one would ever see it again. So this was a way to kind of shine a spotlight on it now, while the stuff is still out there.
Yes, what I've always admired about your work too is that you show a lot of different queer perspectives, maybe internationally, different cultures. I know in my culture, Latino culture, sexuality is fluid. There's a lot of stuff that's left unsaid. I know you travel a lot to a lot of different, like I said, countries. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, have you noticed, would you say, a lot of differences in queer culture internationally, or would you say there's something that really struck you, or?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a very complicated issue. I mean, gender and sexuality, about how much are they constructed by culture and how much are they innate. I mean, nobody really knows. It's it's kind of nature versus nurture issue that is ultimately impossible to kind of completely untangle. But I will say that I've seen tremendous differences. I'm reminded of talking about Latino culture. I went to Cuba a couple times and had a lovely time there. Had a lovely some very hospitable Cuban men. Anyway, so but their approach to sexuality is very, very different from kind of what's happening in the United States now. And there's that Antiskay Anocheska, Before Night Falls, right, which is wonderful. Alonso Arenas, right? This wonderful dissident gay Cuban exile writer comes over to Florida. They made a wonderful film of it. They're probably right now. Comes over to Florida, and he's talking at one point about walking down the street in Miami and watching 2 men hold hands together. And he's like, "Oh, this is so amazing." And it's wonderful, how incredible is it, that 2 men can openly hold hands together. But he was like, I miss Cuba, because in Cuba, I could get any guy to fuck me. Here, only the faggots will fuck me. Which is kind of a fascinating, so that's one example of how we kind of structure sexual acts versus identity. And, there are cultures where, some traditional cultures which unfortunately have, a lot of this stuff has been eradicated now, but traditional societies where you have, where sexuality is very rigid, but the gender is more fluid. So you have, traditional Native American cultures where you have a Berdache or an Amazon, which would be another gender. So, so a man could have sex or marry have sex with or marry a berdache, which is a male, a sexual male or hermaphrodite that takes on a third gender, which has kind of elements of male and man and woman, right? But then they can't have sex with other men and marry other men. They can marry a berdache and have sex with a man with a berdache, and then go off and have sex with a woman, and it doesn't affect his identity whatsoever. And that's their way of dealing with, homosex and heterosex is going to happen in all cultures at all times, right? That's the basis. We know that's happening all the time. The question is how we kind of arrange that culturally. So one of the things in No Straight Lines, it is an international book. I don't deal with, sorry, Caitlin about this before, I don't deal with the Japanese manga in this because that's such a huge amount of material, first of all, and also it's dealing with kind of Japanese concepts around sexuality in general, which are very different. Yeah.
Oh, and on the manga front, there's an anthology of like gay male manga that's coming out in the next.
Oh yeah, from by Chip Kidd and the guys who did the
and Grant Holbein.
Yeah.
Whatever is the Grant Holbein.
Yeah, Holbein. Though that is only one part of the kind of story in the sense that that's Bada material, which is in Japan you've got yaoi or boy love or shonenai comics, which are stories about gay male sex and romance made primarily by women creators for a primarily female audience. And you have a separate market, which is Bada, which is gay male stories made by gay men for gay men, and they look very different, and they're sold in different places, and that's kind of fascinating. And then that dichotomy doesn't happen in the States as much. I mean, you get some of that with slash fiction and stuff like that, but it's a very different kind of marketplace. And a lot of that's about identity stuff as well. So, yeah.
But I was at Kinokuniya Books in Japan, and I took a picture of their other anthology of Tagames.
Yeah.
Next to the yaoi side.
Yeah, and they put it next to the yaoi, which is interesting. It's like when we went to Japan and went to these big comic book stores that were just full of stacks and stacks of comics and huge sections of yaoi, but you couldn't find Bada. Like you had to go to the gay dirty bookstores to find Bada, which was interesting. And I'm not Japanese. Maybe there was something. Maybe there are other kinds of bookstores, but I don't know. But that's what we noticed, was that they were really sold at different places. But the Bada stuff is now just finally being translated in English. It had been translated in Spanish and French, so Tagame had been, but I was actually able to meet him in Toronto, which was awesome. I totally got all fangirl. But yeah, it's really wonderful now. It's finally being translated into English a little bit. Because there's a huge market for it, obviously. And it's great work.
So while we're on the subject of sex,
Yes.
The way that you put No Straight Lines together, I think is also sort of going hand in hand with the way that you've written sex in your unicorn comics. In Hard to Swallow, it's like the forefront of it is definitely sexual content, but there's so many layers behind that are actually showing more complicated situations or complicated characters, revealing something about the individuals and the interaction they're having with each other. So that's one of the things that I think is really kind of unique, is seeing how writing sex brings out contradictions and complexity within culture, but also within individuals. Yeah. And it seems like you're actually trying to also include that here, because the way that sex is treated in these stories just feels so much more personal and deep.
Thank you. The intent here was that, so my parameters with No Straight Lines was it's not erotic comics actually in this book, this collection, because oddly enough, gay erotic comics have been better archived than their literary counterparts. Because of groups like Center for Sex and Culture and the Tom Finley Foundation, that stuff has been better archived. So there was the literary stuff that was most in danger of kind of vanishing. So that was the impetus for No Straight Lines. That being said, it's a lot of it's very sexual. I would make the distinction as erotica or porn is where the primary artistic intention is sexual titillation. And there can be all these other things, artistic intentions as well, but that's the primary one. And literary comics, that's not true. Even if there's a lot of sex, it's not designed primarily for titillation. So when I did Hard to Swallow, I do, well, one interesting thing about American underground comics, I was talking to Gilbert Hernandez about this, and he was saying, there was this, earlier on in the early underground comics and early alternative scene, there was a lot of sexual content in these comics, and that kind of has died down, oddly enough. It's kind of, indie comics have gotten less and less sexual over time, which is odd. So, bring back sex. Comics, because sex is, it's one of the big things in human existence, right? It's like death and birth. I mean, it's like one of the big mysteries. Like, there's kind of endlessly fascinating and mysterious and kind of profound truths about this subject that can be brought out in art and narratives. And unfortunately, a lot of sex comics and a lot of porn narratives are really boring. So why? Why can't we have comics that kind of push buttons as well as push that button? So with Hard to Swallow, I tried to do some of that. And, have like this is a gay porn comic, but I had I talked to this one woman who used to write gay male porn reviews for gay.com under an assumed male pseudonym. And she's a femme dyke, right? And isn't interested in men at all, supposedly, but she said that, I was talking about it, she, busty woman, she said that she used to, way back in the day, she would kind of strap her tits down, put on a hoodie, and kind of go in male drag to the back of the powerhouse and suck guys off the back of the powerhouse. Wow, and you're like, oh my God, sexuality figured out, like some other thing. It's just like, no, you do not. So there's no way to figure out sexuality. It's endlessly complicated. So I was able to do a comic about that. It was my own little I think it's hot, but it's all, but I also, it should, sexuality should be a little challenging too. So it's, it's a line, a delicate balance, but it also should. I will say that sex, and this is something I tell my students actually as well, that sex scenes in comics are tricky, like because it's a visual medium. You can get away with in literary prose talking about very explicitly and graphically talking about sex and sex acts, and still be literary, right? But if you show this and you draw it, people are more likely to associate it now with pornography, right? And then dismiss it. So, but sex again is this huge part of human existence. Why shouldn't we cover this if we're talking about people's lives? Sex is part of that. Sexuality is part of it. So, and you can create character through how people have sex. In a really sophisticated way. So, like we just taught Rudy Madon's exit wounds, and there's this wonderful sequence when the two main characters are finally having sex, and the woman is like, the man's trying to pulling up her shirt, trying to kiss her tits and everything, and she's like pulling her shirt down. She's like, don't look, and it's right in the middle of the sex scene, and it's so indicative of character and so perfect. I want to see more of that stuff. And I think hopefully there's stuff like that here too.
What would you describe as being boring porn?
Porn that has a kind of homogenous nature to it, where you just kind of like all the imagery is the same and all the narrative is the same and everything. When you can tell this is true with any narrative, right? If you can tell the entire narrative from you look at the first page and you know exactly what's going to happen all the way through, and you know what the ending's going to be. That's boring. Like, I don't care what kind of comics or, what kind of narrative it is. And that's especially true with porn. Like, oftentimes you can look at the first page and you know exactly what's going to happen. Ain't nobody got time for that. I mean, that being said, there is, if porn is about sexual titillation, sexual titillation could oftentimes, if you get too challenged intellectually, you can kind of kill the buzz, right? So there is, I understand there's a delicate balancing act here. But
who would you say would be an influence for you?
Well, Gilbert Hernandez did an incredible porn comic called Birdland, which I highly recommend to anyone. And it's wonderful. I remember being so inspired by this. I was just like, anything is possible, and we should all be having orgies everywhere. Everyone, let's do it. because it was just completely pansexual. It was like, he was just kind of postulating this like wild moment of these aliens come down and, you know, have everybody have sex with everybody else, and it's just, it's incredibly liberating. It's just this wonderful. So that was really inspiring to me. And then Hernandez brothers in general are incredible inspiration. When at Comic-Con this year, I got to sit next to Jaime. It was a little bit more shy, and it's harder to get to talk to, but I was signing next to him, and I restrained my fangirl thing. And it was like, that was very cool. But I like talked to him for like an hour about his process, and that was so awesome. You know, other people who were really inspiring, I mean, there's so many. I like a lot of the European cartoonists. So Fabrice Nod, who's in here, he's been translated for the first time in English in his book, which I'm very proud of. And he is kind of the Alison Bechdel in a way of France, where he kind of does this book called Journal, which is about small town gay life and gay life in small town France. And he's an exquisite draftsman. So he's kind of erotic. So he's talking about his hookups and his obsession with certain men, and he won't illustrate the men themselves, but rather, you know, illustrate the chair that he sat on, or the part that he met in that. You know, so this kind of obsessional, wonderful description where by describing and illustrating everything around the person. So that's really, that kind of subtlety is really inspiring to me as well.
Do you think that that's influenced from your writing background?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think in comics, I definitely consider myself a cartoonist, but if you break kind of comics apart into component parts of it, I mean, certainly I'm a better writer than an illustrator. I'm an okay illustrator. I'm getting better. I can probably be good with enough work, but I'm never going to be a great illustrator. I'm never going to have that kind of. But again, Gilbert Hernandez is an inspiration in that sense, because whereas Jaime, I think, is a world-class illustrator, Gilbert is not. But he is as world-class a cartoonist as Jaime is, because his illustrations perfectly match the story, make the story move. They work for what they're trying to do. So that's what I kind of aspire to. I want my illustrations to continue getting better, but I want it, my primary concern is a cartoonist. I tell stories, I'm a narrative guy. All my illustrations have to come in, in order to move the story along. So those are my biggest influences, I would say. You know, they're really spectacular illustrators. I mean, I get a thrill out of looking at this stuff, but that's not enough for me. Like, I need a good storyteller.
What else would you say would be like, so if having a line that pretty much is really predictable, then would you say that the things that seem to be the most interesting to you in any material, pornographic or not, is pretty much the things that surprise you? Like, what would be examples of the things that surprise you?
Fun Home still blows my mind when I look at that book. It's Alison Bechdel's memoir about her growing up with her closeted father, who may or may not have committed suicide, and her relationship to him. And it took me like 3 years of teaching the book every semester to I feel like I kind of cracked the code of it now, where what it really is, it's a creative essay. Like, it's not structured chronologically, right? It's not a simple narrative where this happens and this happens and this happens. She's flipping back and forth between different times of her life constantly. And I was trying to figure out, how does she do this? How does she structure this? What's her skeleton? Like, how is she figuring this out? And what it is, it's not, and I finally figured it out, it's not a story, it's a creative essay that she's written about her relationship with her father, and then she's hung comics onto the creative essay. And that was like, that kind of blew my mind, like, oh, and it was continually surprising. So, you know, as you're reading this book, you don't know where she's going next. You really don't. Like, you don't even know what time, of her life she's going to go next. And she's constantly circling back onto events. So you'll see, some event happen, and then, you watch, and then later on in the book, she comes back to that event from a different angle, a different perspective. I mean, so you literally don't know where she's going from page to page, and that is like edge of the seat kind of, geeky edge of the seat. It's not like, an action movie edge of the seat, but it's, for me, it's like, so that's really inspiring to me. And then people who kind of do unexpected things with narratives in general, where I don't know what's happening next. It's always, some of the mainstream writers are good at this, like a Grant Morrison or Alan Moore, the kind of great writer of comics. That you don't know where he's going to wind up in the story, which is, inspiring.
You've mentioned the on-pop to me before, in that sense too.
writing. And I also, another thing that I find inspiring about him, we're talking about pornography and or just sexuality in comics, is that you don't know where, little girls are like the least sexual objects to me like possible. Like just not within my interest whatsoever. But that book is so well written that you come out of it like, yeah, bunny breasts. Yeah. What? Like that was like, but because he gets you in the head of this straight pedophile, and okay, and that's the transcendent power of good storytelling, right? Where you can actually inhabit someone else's desires and realities and experiences. So I would aspire to that. Like, I'd love for my work to be read not just by queer people as an eternal dialogue with queer communities, but now we have access to getting our stories out for everybody to read. So if I can get straight people or maybe people who haven't had the same kind of experiences as I have, and get them to be able to kind of inhabit my brain for a little bit. That was with the memoir thing. I've lived a kind of crazy. So I mean, if I remember living a ridiculous life, I might as well make some ridiculous out of that. I don't know that people can relate to. So.
Okay, so I was just over when you showed me. So I guess last note to end on would be there's a lot of the stuff here that's personal in the past. What you've worked on is very personal, either it's been creative nonfiction or not. And now you have this compilation of stories that's very much based on community work and collaboration. What would be the next thing for you to do?
So I'm working on right now a graphic novel for, I'm in an MFA program as well as a student, as well as teaching one, because I'm insane. And I'm working with Rachel Pollock, who's this really amazing woman who used to work with in DC Comics. And she's remarkable. But so I'm working on a graphic novel, a big graphic novel. It's set in the Kink.com Armory here in San Francisco. And it's going to be a gay porn star who comes to Kink.com and meets a closeted gay ghost from the Armory past. And it's kind of a conversation between different generations of queer identities and like how you experience this stuff. I also I'm throwing in a meta narrative of the side characters from the Golden Age Wonder Woman, because that shit was totally out there. And Steve Trevor was the ultimate submissive SM bottom, and Etta Candy, her sidekick, was this total dom daddy dyke, and I just love that shit. So I'm having those as like the continuing adventures of Steve Trevor and Etta Candy, or moving through it. So I'm going full on fiction, but I'm weaving in elements of, as I said, I did act in porn films as well. I used my name was Steve Trevor. So just my little shout out to the comic book geeks, right? So I'm like using that. Like, my character in the book takes on the same name, and like so. And I think I'm gonna have Trina Robbins come in as a character in the book. So I like mixing. Now I want to kind of take the fiction stuff, take the memoir stuff, and So, anyone have any questions?
There's a lot coming out.
I'm writing the script. I'm writing the script now. This is in terms of long form stuff, I've only done 48-page pieces. I've done a couple of 48-page books, but I've never done anything longer than that. So this is my first attempt at a graphic novel size. So it'll be a couple years, but it's going to happen.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I want to,